So we're going to get started. You are on the roundtable on moral panics. I'm sure this will be a lively and interesting discussion. My name is Lindsay Grace. I'm a Knight Chair at the University of Miami, and I've written a few things on moral panics, games, addiction, and these histories we'll talk about a little more. If each of the panelists could also, or rather roundtable guests, if we will, could introduce themselves. We'll start with Mia, then go to Andy, and then Roger.
Ooh, nice intro, Lindsay. That was very radio host of you. So I am Mia Consalvo. I'm a professor of communication studies, and I'm the Canada Research Chair in Game Studies and Design at Concordia University in Montreal.
I'm Andy Phelps. I'm a professor at American University, where I run the Game Lab, and also a professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, which is where I am right now.
I'm Roger Altizer. I am the director of the Therapeutic Games and Apps Lab at the University of Utah and the co-founder of the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program there.
Great. Thanks. We try to keep the introductions nice and short. We will, so you understand the structure of this roundtable, we'll talk for 40 minutes or so. We're happy to answer questions in between. And then what we're going to do is just sort of go through a couple of the core questions and give you a little context for the conversation. But we'll be watching the chat to make sure that we answer any questions that come up. But at the 40-minute mark, we'll also have about 20 minutes for sort of general Q&A. But the idea is to give some foundation and then continue from there. So one of the things to sort of note about this conversation is that all four of us have actually spoken sort of publicly about this before. If you've attended Games for Change in 2019, then you saw our panel on the topic, which was a derivation particularly focused on social impact games. But we've talked to GDC on this topic, and we've actually produced a couple of resources for people. So at the end of that, or maybe in the sort of standard comfort of conversation, we'll mention some of those resources and kind of get us going. All right, so I'm going to start with the first question, and it's a real easy one. Basically, actually, I don't know if it is easy. Why do we even care about moral panics? From perspective, just as we sort of respond, we should help you understand where we're coming from and the kinds of institutions and research and work that we do. But generally, who wants to answer that or start off with that big question? Why do we care about moral panics?
You do mean aside from being in the middle of one? I think that it's actually a good point, right? I think that if we look at the politicization and even moralization of mask wearing during COVID-19, it affects health and well-being, safety, and so many of the things that we all hold dear, right? It sort of cuts across debate really quickly and minimizes logic and even loyalty, to be frank, towards our fellow human beings when these large moral panics sweep in. They're the death of conversation, and unfortunately the only cure for them is more conversation.
Sure. So in the context of video games, what we're sort of talking about is that the moral panics may actually prevent us from maybe pro-social work in games, or it may prevent us from having reasonable conversations around benefits and detriments. And we're going to try and talk about both of those. But maybe Mia, I didn't know if you wanted to run in and offer some moral panic, particularly.
Sure. Well, I guess another reason to care, I mean, in the US and maybe in other places too, it's an election year, and politicians are always quick to seize on, issues that they can moralize about, that are very emotional, that provoke strong reactions. And we've seen this historically with video games, from various, senators, representatives, from presidents in the past, that, games are turning kids into killers, or that only bad kids play in arcades, and so we have to keep our nice middle class kids away from the influence of those ruffians, where they're because they're going to drop out of school and start taking drugs. And interestingly, like, you can see actually the evolution over time, because that used to be the worry with arcades. And then slowly the discourse changed in arcades, where young boys and how to be comfortable with technology and get a leg up, in their future work. So you know, they're definitely not static, and pretty much all media have experienced, you know, some kind of moral panic. But, you know, I would be shocked if I didn't see some politician, you know, show up soon with some argument about Fortnight or whatever, you know, they're going to find next. I would love to see one, you know, come up with something about like the latest Animal Crossing. But, you know.
In true fashion for the panel, or rather this discussion, and thank you for sharing that article. One interesting or really important in the larger context of this particular conversation is the repeated history that we've seen with elements of games being an issue to a contemporary audience. So the title of this roundtable includes 2,500 years of history. And so I've written before about this notion that say there's a light sort of critique of games that form the origin of chess, going as far back as the Buddha. So that's mentioned in the article that you guys just have in the chat right now. And it focuses on the idea that often, and I think this is what you were hinting at, Mia, there is this sort of scapegoating that occurs. If we don't understand a shift in society, or we don't understand changes, there's this reliance on often the sort of the oddity of games, the cultural oddity of games, or the newness. So the contemporary perspective is on technological games with less critique on sport, or less critique on other elements that are playful. So it's good to remind people of those.
Yeah.
And
to add to that, also, just let me add on, you can see how like the moral panic really touches on emotions and avoids logic, because like you're saying with this history and with new technologies, you know, like with the phone, it was, you know, girls were going to be seduced by men with, you know, like sexy voices calling them in their homes because, you know, they could never approach them on the street, you know, because the phone reached into your home, you know, in a way that other technologies didn't. With games, like you see two different discourses, right? The first is, oh my God, kids are just passively sucking up, you know, this violence, you know, and kind of the TV argument. But then you also hear people say, but it's even worse because they're pulling the trigger. Right, so they're enacting the violence, and you know, I've seen both examples of those.
And I think that, you know, we can. Oh, Andy, do you want to talk? I'm sorry, I was going to answer this question twice, and that's just rude.
Well, I do want to hear your answer, Roger. I guess the thing that I would point out is that, I guess from my perspective, the core emotion behind a moral panic, right, is fear. Right, and so fear makes people really susceptible to being led down non-logical paths, and we've seen that at least in American politics over and over again. And that's one of the things that, you know, like in my role at Hevga, that I've had to deal with pretty repeatedly, which is, you know, the political apparatus is actually really savvy at capitalizing on people's fear, and in particular with games, this sort of generational divide on who plays what kind of game. You know, so you see a lot of politicians will use that structurally as a way to appeal to a very particular demographic.
Great. Roger, do you have a quick add?
Yeah, I do. I think that this also boils down to some real, in praxis, some real nuts and bolts kinds of things. All of us and a lot of the people, both on this on the thread and in this community, had to do a lot of work in the early days of games education, combating this stuff on campuses. Right? We couldn't just start teaching games. We had to convince people it was okay to teach games, and the largest hurdles were those around moral panic. And in my own work, I've been doing games for health for, I don't know, a better part of a decade now. And in the beginning, my deck was why games are good for you, and convincing doctors and other clinicians that it was okay to do games at Utah. And I remember in the very beginning having to take an entire year deliberately, like embarking on we need to do internal PR for games to have the right to study games, right? Yep. And that's not just a year of my time lost, which is fine. I've lost years all sorts of ways. But for an institution and the resources and the potential that was there, it's a lot of time to convince people it's okay to study a thing. And it was always based on these kind of moral panic arguments. Yeah.
So this actually, combining that comment with another question we plan to discuss, Andy, you brought up the sort of the utility of moral panic, that it can be used as a sort of a political brandish weapon for or against games. I wonder if anyone has any comments on both any shifts they've seen in the last, like Roger kind of hinted at this, shifts that we've seen in the last couple of years. I think in the context of COVID, we could even start talking about this push-pull where games are a great way to keep people busy, but at the same time, are we still worried about addiction and other moral panics? And then also, if anyone has any thoughts on even specific examples of where moral panics may have been used for these kind of objectives, for or against supporting moral panics.
Sure.
This is a big question.
It is a big question. Well, I can talk about in the context of my work very quickly. Like I said, I had to spend a good decade doing this kind of work, but just 2 weeks ago, I had a hospital system contact me and say, hey, listen, we're interested in games for health. And they brought up the fact that they used to have to try to convince the clinicians that it was okay to talk about games at work, and no longer is that the case. And they've seen more applications for virtual reality and video games in particular in use in hospitals than ever before. And we've seen some of those talks here at Games for Change. So I'd say in that subdomain, there's a lot of interest in it, in both funding, which is important, and people researching it.
Great.
Yeah,
Others?
I would say in the context of my world, one of the things that we've seen, and I made this point at the panel yesterday, but I think it's a big one, is so we would historically get folks coming to us from other elements of campus saying, hey, can you help us make a game about X because we want to teach Y? And the general understanding from sort of outside games programs varies widely on like what it takes to make a game, what a game even is, et cetera. I know you made the joke once about, I'd like a case of games. And it fits really well, right? I think one of the things that's happened with COVID is that a whole bunch of people had to start doing what they were doing online, and they went, wow, this is bad, right? Like Zoom sucks. And all of a sudden there was kind of this—
But hop-in rules.
Yeah, right? But all of a sudden there was this recognition of like, oh wait, those games folks have been doing online engagement stuff increasingly well for kind of a long time. And now they're coming to us and saying, how can we know more about what you do to incorporate that in our own work? And that's a real shift, because it used to be like they wanted to approach doing something with games as basically, can you take my thing that already exists and game it, right? And now all of a sudden it's like, no, this might be a real thing and we might need to really understand it. So there's been kind of a big shift there. And I think that's an opportunity for those of us that are in games to better integrate with the rest of our campuses.
Yeah. I think it'll have to be done well, though, because, I don't really know what the long-term impact of, this, remote teaching will be. Like my university is pretty much all online this fall, except for a few courses that have to have some in person. And so I can see some people thinking like, oh, it would be nice if I had like a virtual world space instead of Zoom, or I need some kind of simulation that's going to do this or that. And of course, first of all, like you can't just say, oh, sure, 2 weeks, we'll have it for you. But also, I don't know if, even if they got something decent, and then they used it, if the next semester or the next year we can go back to classrooms and they say that was fun, and kind of like a little bit of the early attention to VR, you would see people try it for 5 minutes and say, wow, that was great. And then they put down the goggles and we're like, okay, like that was enough for me. Yeah. And so it will be interesting to see if that enthusiasm lasts, because I know for me, like I really want to go back to a classroom, physical classroom when it's safe to do that.
I agree. I think it's important to talk about it. Like one of the things I think, if I may real quick, it's if you look at the history of moral panics, is once they've started, they stay, right? And that's why you have to be vigilant. So if we look at sort of the anti-immigration rhetoric that's being used right now, you can go back to the 1840s with the nativist movement and sort of see that thing crop up again and again. And the same with violent video games, right? The violent video games debates were done and gone for a while. And then, we went and had someone try to use them as a distraction in the gun debate in America and show them on the floor of the Senate again, right?
Someone
someone did that. But that's why these conversations are important, right? That they keep coming up again and again, because as new generations and new opportunities to scapegoat come up, video games is a prime target for it, and even Animal Crossing.
I think this is a good point to actually bring up this perpetual push-pull. So I think critics would highlight the reality that we talk about the engagement potential of games, and there's a question of when it becomes too engaging, is it addictive? As that is one of the contemporary issues with games. And one of the moral panics around games in my own perspective. And I wrote a book that talks about how to make engaging experiences through game design. So I get the tension, but the reason I want us to, I think one of the things we need to explore, and this is the reason I asked the question about utility, is what sort of patterns, if anyone sees them, are occurring around, if I could use this phrase, weaponizing the moral panic to meet specific objectives. So just as we saw, and I think actually, Andy, in our prior conversation, you did a really good job of highlighting this, there was this sort of oddity to 1 year, the WHO, for some perspectives, and actually Roger had some comments and Mia had some comments on this too. One point we got the WHO saying, wow, depending on how the press covered it, there's real concern about games, but at the same time, you have later observations about, hey, games may help us through COVID because it offers Animal Crossing socialization and it offers educational engagement for the K through 12 crowd. So if you guys could talk a little about that, that would be great.
Sure, I can jump in, I guess, to start. So yeah, it was an interesting 180, and maybe Andy can talk about the WHO stuff, but I noticed, and I got calls from reporters about a month or two into lockdown, shortly after Animal Crossing was released, saying like, hey, what's up with this, right? And you saw suddenly, and part of this is linked to the larger moral panic debate about screen time. And suddenly, screen time was just fine because parents needed to work from home and, kids needed something to do when they couldn't hang out with their kids. That should be the slogan, screen time is just fine. But the reporters were suddenly saying like, why is, everyone on Animal Crossing, and I think lots of academics in game studies talked about how well, it's a way to connect with your friends in this space since we can't actually get together. It's this cool like island where everything is fine. I know Andy has talked about, games give you a sense of control and agency in a time when you feel like you have very little control or agency in the world, like when you're being told the best thing you can do is go home and sit there, right? Like, okay, I'll go do that. So
video games, we've got you.
Yeah. And even for other types of games, like if they're more violent games, you could say the same thing, like it's a space where you can blow off steam, where you can, exercise a skill, you can feel like you're getting better at something, and suddenly it was just sort of curious since I've talked to the press for 2 decades, like how suddenly they were like, oh yeah, like this is great, right? Like games can be good.
Yeah, you want to go first, Roger, or you want me to?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna drop my controversial thing about where we talk about addiction and not being afraid to talk about addiction.
Great.
Want me to do that?
Sure.
For it.
So one of the things I think that's interesting about when we talk about moral panics is the reductionism that happens, right? And so if you look at, I think the mask thing is a great thing where all of a sudden we have these terms like anti-masker, right? And you end up with these pro and anti-video game debates and are video games addictive and not addictive? And every time a scholar stands up to talk about video game addiction, we get accused of being industry shills if we're trying to add nuance to these things, right? But in reality, one of the things that makes a moral panic complicated is the way of opposing it is to oppose it, and that makes it actually stronger, right? And so when we talk about games addiction, and you'll hear a lot of people talk about there isn't game addiction, the thing that's missing in that is, as people who like to talk about game addiction, we frequently don't want to talk about people who are harmed in video games, people who have played video games to excess, and people whose lives are hurt by the use of video games. And that doesn't mean it's the game's fault. It doesn't mean that they're addicted. That's a complicated conversation. But there are certainly people who have been harmed or caused self-harm in the proximity of video games. And this is true of lots of things, right? Like back in the day, there was moral objections to exercise, right? And this notion of the abstracted notion of exercise. It was a bad thing. It took you away from church and work and education and all that. And the bicycle was immoral, right? And certainly today, the bicycle is a great thing. People love their bicycles. No one's going to say that and exercise addiction is a real thing, but no one's going to say that exercise is a bad thing, right? No one's going to say don't exercise. Exercise is evil. People get hurt doing exercise all the time. People get hurt physically doing exercise. People find themselves in moral quandaries when they, try and skirt outside the side of the Boston Marathon and get in a car and get to the front of the line and get caught. People spend too much money and encounter debt on exercise. And we can talk about
seriously, yeah. Also, Roger, at the beginning of the pandemic, remember there was the running shaming going on.
Oh, yeah, totally. Same thing, right? Same thing. Right.
Yeah.
And in the context of the conversation, I think one of the good things to remember is that we have this history going back so many years. So there were Romans who were blamed with their dice games for moral corruption.
Yeah.
Later, people who were worried about how obsessive folks were around chess. Like, it just keeps coming up. And it's interesting that in the context of games, whether digital or not, it's an easy scapegoat. And it may be. And I think some of the reading and some of the claims are around this, the diametric or the opposition between a work life and a play life. And when a proletariat or whoever is supposed to be quote unquote controlled ends up doing stuff that isn't part of their work life, it becomes detrimental, whether it's singing or going to a bar or doing any of these things that often are equated to morality, but often have to do with productivity, which is why your exercise example is so interesting. There's a point at which we want people to exercise, and then there's a worry that they're going to be too exercised or they're going to have too much free time.
Right. And so I guess I would say that in our talks about moral panics, we have to be very careful to not want to take up the opposite banner, right? That the binary is actually part of the problem. When we make this thing a binary, we end up feeding the other side. It makes the other side look more legitimate. It makes the panic look legitimate. If there's a light switch, off is a valid option to on, right? And so we have to be very careful to keep these conversations complicated as opposed to overly reducing them.
This is a great time to drop in 2 questions at once. And then Andy, if you want to hop on that last one, you can do that as well. But one of the questions I think a lot of people would ask and want to discuss anyway is the sort of role of a person in the industry to defend or not defend the actions of the industry, because you were talking about a we, and complementary sort of researchers in the same way. Are researchers and academics responsible for supporting a sort of healthier understanding of moral panics or about the pluses and minuses of gameplay? Yeah,
so I guess I'm going to respond to Roger's thing, and I'm going to do it in a way that starts to address the question that you just asked, I hope.
Perfect.
So, which is...
And you can feel free to make fun of me too, Andy. It's fair.
So, like the WHO thing was really, really interesting, right? Because what the WHO actually said and the way that it was covered in the press were wildly divergent, right? And so the WHO comes out and says, hey, there's this thing about games addiction. We need to start looking at this. We need to start studying this. And we can't do that unless we have a classification in our systems so that we can begin to address it, right? And that instantly became on the front page of USA Today, right? Game addiction is a real thing, says science, right? And so that... Right. And so that immediately changes the entire context of that conversation. And then that's why there is this perceived 180 when they come out the year following in the midst of COVID and they say, hey, maybe games aren't so bad. They have some socialization aspects that are pretty good when we're all locked in our houses. So it's very interesting to me that when WHO first put that thing out, right, that like, oh, now there's game addiction is proven real, right? That now we had to have a whole bunch of panels about it, and the industry had to get involved and say, hey, like that's not like so totally proven, right, by quote unquote science. And like there's a whole bunch of nuance there that the academics can look at. But from the popular perspective, you turn around and watch that get weaponized almost immediately. So if you were following the right-wing press, which most of us don't follow, right, the right-wing press hyped that right back into, hey, remember when Donald Trump talked about violence in video games? He was right. Right? And none of us really want to go there because that's conflating a whole bunch of crazy issues. But again, it's that capitalization on the panic, right? And so what I think one of the things that we as industry are responsible for, and I include myself in industry as well as academics, is the general understanding of how a game gets made from the layperson is both hilarious and sad, right? And if you need examples of that, just go out on your average user forum and it's like, well, why didn't you put in networking, right? That takes like 2 days, right? And anyone in the industry is like 2 years, so but I think what that does is when you don't know how something is made, right? That narrative of, oh, like there's people that study how to make it addicting, right? And they make this thing so you can never put it down on purpose. And we're all just little rats in a Skinner box, right? And so I think we as people studying this, we as people making these things need to be more open and more honest about what they are, why we're developing them the way they are, so that folks can be informed. Because the only thing that combats fear in that context is knowledge.
A good example actually of that we had talked about prior, sort of prepping for this, that I think I just want to highlight for everyone, is that we really did start discussing the misunderstanding of game production fundamentally. So we can talk a little more about this, but one of the questions is sort of moral relativism. So the fact that specific regions have certain moral priorities or moral panics. So we often talk about the moral panics that precipitate from sort of a Western perspective on violence, but you can also see the same sort of things in Asia and Europe happening at different times with different impetus. And one of the things that's interesting to remind people as we discuss moral panics is how non-regional large AAA games actually are. So your art team may be based in Asia, but your design team may be based in Canada. And that a lot of this magic that people think may be built into a game, this nefarious approach around things like addiction, are actually the product of 300 or 400 people. And I don't, we have enough problem trying to get 7 people to agree on things that are beneficial to them. But I think a misunderstanding of games and thinking perhaps that a game designer is this master sitting in a throne going, now addict 245 people over there, is part of that misunderstanding of how games are made and work.
Right.
Yep.
And I would add too that like moral panics are definitely culturally relative. I mean, if you look at early Nintendo games, there were a lot more references to sexuality, lots of like nudity and risque, sexual behavior gets cut out of like American games, if they want to get an M rating and not an adult rating. But then, the violence gets stripped out if they're going to Germany or other places. The addiction discussion is a lot more accepted in China and Korea and Japan. They've talked about that for years, whether, rightly or wrongly. But just to say, you can't just apply a blanket like this is the moral panic, like yardstick to everything. It's going to be different depending on the situation you find yourself in. And you're right, Linsday, if you've got a game that's made for a global audience, suddenly, and Kate Edwards talks about this, a lot in her work about how, suddenly the game developer has to think about, all of these questions that they probably never imagined that they would, like what flags are you going to use? Are you going to refer to this place as a country or a territory? What kind of music, suddenly this music is offensive. All of these things, can spark something that, you probably never intended, but that somebody else might feel very, very strongly about. Right? And just to say, like, and there was a question about cheating. Let me just try and bring it in, but I'm still chewing on it. This idea of cheating in games.
So that everybody who might see this later knows.
Oh, in the chat, people, AM was talking about what's the relevance or role of cheating in relation to this. And it's a broad question, so I think it would fit in a lot of ways. But I was just thinking about how, in one situation, something definitely is seen by some people as cheating, and in others, it's a totally legitimate activity. If you look at the early, free-to-play model of games in Korea, lots of people thought it was just completely acceptable to grind and spend real money for items in game. Whereas in the West, we were like, that's totally cheating, right? Like that's outside the bounds of acceptable behavior, and you're purchasing a win, and it has to be this meritocracy and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you could apply the same thing, I think, with like, and that's, you know, how like moral panics and like the have come in, and it shows like the shaky foundations of that, you know, just, you know, that there is no absolute right and wrong here.
Yep. This is a good chance. I'm not going to pivot per se, but I'm wondering if we have some thoughts on, we've talked a lot, like cheating is a very good example of something that's probably more common in the media spectrum for something like gaming than it would be for, say, film, books, film movies. I'm wondering if anyone has any comments around lessons we can learn from the histories or current status of other media. I mean, often when we talk about moral panics, we talk about comic books and comic book burning in the US, or we talk about film,
Pinball.
You know, like the comic book code, et cetera. Does anyone want to add anything on those dimensions?
Yeah, I think reading's an interesting one, right? So if you think about cheating and reading, okay, you have game book examples where people were putting their fingers in the choose your own adventure games and reading like with a claw, right? And certainly people would argue that was cheating, you know, or not cheating. But interesting enough, this idea of books that called themselves cheating, right? Like the Cliff Note derivatives that called themselves, you know, cheats, right? They're these things that you could use. And certainly there was all sorts of moralizing, whether that was good or whether that was bad. And even today in the academy, right? When we teach people to read, there's a lot of controversy about how do you teach people to read? They teach you to read radically differently in graduate school than they do growing up, because you have to consume so much reading and you want to read it critically. And so the act of reading that you learn in graduate school is very different than what they teach you in elementary school. And many of the things that we do in graduate school, they might have considered cheating in elementary school, right? So many of those methods and tactics. So yeah, so the moralization of things around media is, I don't know. There's a right way and a wrong way to do things. The problem with polysemic anything, right, is there's lots of ways to read things, and it's hard to teach people that.
One of the folks in the chat actually did a good job of trying to connect the morality and cheating question, and I thought it was quite useful. It was essentially just talking about that edge of cultural norms and the fact that there are sort of, as you were mentioning, Roger, there's a sort of right way to consume the media and a not right way to consume the media, and cheating corrupt that. It's interesting to ask, and this is a harder question, but how moral panics are either subverted through such, we'll call it play, cheating, or flirting with the cultural norm edges, and then, or supported, if moral panics are supported. So for example, you know, I'm thinking of people who might emphasize all the violent content in a game that may have 3% quote unquote violent content, but the way that they've demonstrated the game, you can do all these things. They're actually emphasizing to their claims about morality within the game. And I'm sure there are other examples, but just wondering.
Well, I think there's a great example of that though, and it's Death Race, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
One of the first moral panics around video games in 1976 is Death Race, and the game only looks marginally better than Pong. Right, like it's a black screen with a little white thing that's supposed to be a car. Yep. It's mostly a line. It's got some edges and things that look like trees and dots, right? And you run over things. But the art around it, the art on the cabinet, and more importantly, the language around it, was what really people were upset about, right? And the framing is really the truth of this, and it's been truth since then. It very rarely has anything to do with the game itself, right? Like Nick Bowman did this great work on media and violence that says it's not about the frequency of violence for many people, right? It's about, is it justified, or the tone? Because there's all sorts of media that has way more acts of violence per minute than video games, but they're not offensive because either the tone is silly in the case of a Warner Brothers cartoon, or it's justified in the case of a war movie, right? And those things are more complicated with video games.
Yep. And it's interesting too how players themselves can sort of refocus a game in a way that even the developers didn't intend, or maybe they just didn't consider. So, and this is coming from my grad students who are doing super interesting work in this area. But you know, they're looking at games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Far Cry 5, and showing how some players who create these YouTube, you know, like playthroughs, a couple of them have gone through and targeted all the women, the NPCs, and made, you know, like incredibly misogynistic comments as they're like, I'm hunting through all the feminists. I'm going to kill all the effing feminists. I'm going to, you know, do that. And, you know, it would be incredibly easy, you know, again, for these politicians to sort of take these videos out of context. And I mean, you're like, yes, the game does let you do that. Like it's going back to the hooker cheat in Grand Theft Auto. You know, the player, the initiative, and, you know, doing something that, you know, a great many other players would find themselves morally offensive.
Yep. Yeah. I'm gonna, we only have 4 minutes or so before we start doing Q&A, and I think this is a good moment to bring it back to Games for Change in particular. So because we're talking about intention and then perceived intention with the way that people are playing and cheating and doing sort of like Let's Plays where they emphasize one element of the gameplay, I'm curious if anyone has any comments generally about how we navigate the space between social impact games and moral panics. Obviously, there are questions around, you know, we want some games in the classroom, but not all games. How do we help people understand that space? And then also, how do we help people sort of generally understand or position their own perception or use in the utility context of games around the social impact space in particular?
I'm going to use one of my terrible catchphrases.
Great.
And I think it's the rhetoric around games addiction is a major part of the cultural capital that Games for Change, impact, and serious games feed on. So one of the things that's been true in a lot of our careers, if anyone has ever made serious or social impact games, the response from funders or journalists, like half the articles we've ever written that are pro games, are, oh my God, you can use games for that, right? And the initial position there is that games are bad. And then there's surprise that you can use games for anxiety reduction or education or empathy, or to tell the story of people who've been historically marginalized, or to let people tell their own stories, for goodness sakes, right? But that, and so that's a complicated relationship, as all cultural capital is, right? It's that the fear around games and standing in opposition to it has really worked out well for a lot of games in these kinds of communities, right? And certainly has worked well for us in health games for sure.
Great.
Not that it's something we shouldn't dismantle, obviously, but.
Me or Andy?
Andy, go ahead.
I see. I guess I would say one of the things that I think is really important is that you know, we keep there's this weird duality, right, where we say, well, the games addiction stuff isn't proven, and you know, media effects and this and that and the other. And we fill out a grant application where we have to prove that we're going to make somebody think differently about something by the act of playing a game, right?
Yep.
And that also feels really, you know, like if A, then why not B? And so that gets a little strange, right? And so I think one of the things is that we as a community of Games for Change people need to more fluently understand and recognize that pieces of media, those pieces of media have, is not necessarily wholly contained within the media itself. It's right, in the same way that film or text or music have an individualized effect on different people. And you know, I think that the way that we've thought about the funding apparatus has damaged a bit of the design space in terms of what we think could be effective, and the way that we can evaluate that individually rather than holistically.
Great. Mia?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it was a few years ago at Games for Change, Matt Wise made a great point about how, you know, again, following what Andy's saying with this assumption, and like if you think about the early talk about games where you create simulations and, you know, you're like, okay, so I'm going to simulate, you know, the election system and show how it's broken so that people will understand. And you know, but there's always that unspoken assumption following it that, and then they will do something about it, right? And you can't just assume that anything is going to happen afterwards, because especially now, people are so entrenched, you know, in their own positions that, you know, they may just utterly reject it. They may never want to play it. They may say this game is broken and biased, right? Like it's so that, and I know, like, but at least in public, you know, you tend to get that, oh, if we just explain how the immigration system is up with this game, then people will be moved to act. And you're like, you know, documentaries have done that for a long time. And sometimes it might help push people a little bit, but, you know, it doesn't fix things entirely.
In the context of wider media studies stuff that we were discussing, I think one of the easiest ways to talk about it is that, you know, like I myself often in my research and my books and all this sort of stuff talk about the idea that readers read a book, moviegoers watch a film, and game players do. Right? They do the game, they do the story. And one of the tensions there is obviously that intention is one of our key questions. And what you just mentioned, I think harkens to a theme that we see across a lot of the moral panic literature, which is understanding, having that sort of literacy for understanding how play works, interpreting play, understanding notions like persuasive play. It's a kind of ludo-literacy. So one of the challenges in the evolution of the moral panic of games is that games also, the expected ludo-literacy changes over time. Knowing how to play chess does not transfer to knowing how to play football or American football or soccer. And so what's interesting is recognizing that there is a kind of, getting back to the question of researchers and academics and industry folks, there is a latency period in how people understand games and understand intention. I think would be interesting to, for people to think of. We hit the 6:43 moment, so we're about 43 minutes into our discussion. I'm gonna paste in the chat a resource that all four people here had contributed to that helps you understand some of the content and some resources. So they're offered by all of us, and the URL is simply gameclasses.com/gamesadvocacy. I will paste it here, and for those of you who might be watching this video later, again, that is gameclasses.com/gamesadvocacy. At this point, we're going to switch over to Q&A. So we'll take questions as people have them. The chat is sort of blowing up. There's lots of people asking questions, so I think
really good stuff too. That chat's been exciting to watch.
Good discussion here.
Yeah.
And if you find yourself, I'm going to try and reiterate the question. But do let us know if you feel like you need to be on screen to ask the question, or if you've got some content that you need to share.
You know, this idea about games brainwashing you has been popping up a bit, and I think that's an interesting one to talk about, because I think Andy sort of hinted at it as well. And that's a complicated question.
So we make sure that people understand there was a question asked about brainwashing. So if you could articulate that. Yeah. Thank you for,
So, you know, I think there's a little debate going on in the comments about can games brainwash you? And really it's a media effects question, right? This direct relationship between can this thing that's on a screen or played with affect you in a way. And it's only going to get more complicated in ways that are going to help us, right? So new research on MRI and fMRI data of playing games versus watching films or reading books is really interesting. And I'm on a team that just published research on how there are certain games that you can play that will change your response to antidepressants. So treatment-resistant older adults who aren't responding to antidepressants can play a course of video games for a few weeks, and then their antidepressants start to work more, right? And that's just brain plasticity and some of the psychological things around that. But it's really interesting stuff, right? But it's what makes this conversation so complicated, right? Just like, again, with exercise or anything else that people can get hurt with, I think we have to be honest about these conversations.
And also just to historicize it, also the brainwashing idea, it relates back to media. There used to be the hypodermic needle theory effect in media and film and television, that literally, you know, you were shooting the content into people and they would automatically, you know, believe whatever it was that they heard or saw. There's a good question from someone about loot boxes too. So Andy, if you wanted to.
Oh, I was just going to make the point that I listened to my Ozzy Osbourne records backwards, and I've never actually been the same. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So the question on loot boxes,
injected straight into the ear.
Yeah. And this is a common problem, right? We actually mentioned some of those examples later. But the question on loot boxes, I think, is a good one to segue to. Basically, Mr. Almeida is asking, how did loot boxes enter into the conversation of games and moral panic, if at all? And how do people have things to say about it, particularly around the laws passed to limit it? I have a really quick thought, which is that I think one of the most interesting things to do when you're looking at a moral panic is ask a fundamental question about who benefits, right? It's sort of the investigative question if you were a detective. And one of the tensions, I did a bunch of research on this last year for a potential conversation more publicly with the government. And in short, one of the things you have to start asking is how the quote scapegoating, who benefits from the scapegoating? And one of the questions about managing loot boxes is about its comparison to gambling and how close it actually ends up being like gambling. And you can imagine that there are organizations that feel that their gambling portions are actually being undermined. So that group may be opposed to loot boxes. And likewise, there are people who are trying to find another reason to dislike games or gameplay. One of the best arguments I've commonly seen around moral panics is this question or this observation that often moral panics are a way of dealing with a problem after it's occurred. So for example, while sexual addiction may be a thing, you find that many people who've done horrible things in the world of sexual harassment, celebrity producers, for example, then move on to seek sexual addiction training. And the question is a little bit of a, which came first, chicken or egg, but it's a question of whether or not people are using it as a way to make claims about poor decisions that they've made in the past. And this is actually what we saw in something called the Darren Mulleter letter, where we were looking, basically, a person killed someone and then retroactively blamed the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game. And that turned into a Dungeons and Dragons is evil. So I always encourage people to look critically at who benefits and why they are scapegoating one media over another.
Right. And I would add for the loot boxes, I mean, that one quickly became, but the children, consider the children.
The children, Mia?
And, you know, I know they were just, you know, spending thousands of dollars, you know, basically on their parents' credit cards. And they didn't understand, you know, that it was really gambling and you know, like their actual chances of winning something, or they had no concept of what money was. And I mean, if you look at like the proposed laws and the laws that have passed, and you know, like I've gone and a few of the other folks here have gone to like conferences where lawyers who study video games, you know, get all excited about this, you know, and they talk about the global impact and like the different regulations and policy decisions. And some places have banned loot boxes, some countries and some states, and or they have different, you know, regulations about the ways that they can advertise them. And it's all couched in the language of protecting the children, right? Even though, you know, I'm sure there are adults who lose a lot of money, you know, and occasionally you see articles about them as well. But like, it's sort of that quick knee jerk because of course, children can't make that decision for themselves. And it's also tied to a lot of emphasis. I think it comes, it goes back to like, look at these greedy game studios, you know, that are doing this. You know, aren't they making enough money on their own, especially if it's like a game that you've already paid $60 or $70 for, and it has loot boxes as well. And like, even the discourse within the game industry can be, these are not real developers. This goes back to social games and Facebook games. These are not the people who really care about games, who make good games. These are just people who are in it to make a buck.
Yeah, and yet I think what's interesting is that, you know, so there's that vilification of industry, right? Which we've certainly, you know, that's a very popular narrative right now, particularly in a time of vast wealth inequality and so forth. And yet when you saw the legislation proposals hit the floor, right? I mean, that was also a pretty calculated and somewhat crass move from politicians that were, let's just going to say, in tight spaces in some of their races, that went looking for an issue that would target older voters, right? Because it's not like the 7-year-olds are going to vote against them, right? And so you specifically pitch that issue about the children because you're appealing to a very particular demographic, and you're doing so in a way that's in your political best interest, right? And so it's there's shades of it on every side, right? And that's the way that these panics get utilized.
Andy, you brought up a tie into an earlier question, and I apologize, but my interface is a mess, so I can't actually go back in the chat history. So if someone can find it, that'd be great. But there was a question I saw earlier about moral panics, and particularly the way that the industry itself works, employment. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that or can find the question.
I remember seeing that one. I think it was about sort of like the panic about labor within the games industry,
yes.
Right? And I think that's that's an interesting one, right? Because there is sort of this groundswell of like, but wait, what are we doing? And like, are we slaughtering all these young developers, and they're never going to be the same, and all this kind of stuff. And I think on the one hand, right, this as an educator, there are some nuggets of truth to this, right?
Yep.
Like I've sent students to studios that have been, I'm going to say, mistreated, and those there are those issues, right? And then certainly with everything that's been happening on the Me Too stuff and the Twitter stuff and all of this, there are some legitimate bad actors in all of those things, but I also I get worried when things all of a sudden become the whole industry, right? Or the whole anything, really. Because there's always, some nuance, right? There's always, there are some great studios that are legitimately trying to do the right thing by their developers and so on and so forth, right?
We're participating in a conference that's a section of the industry that's about being, sort of creating social good through games.
Right.
And so it would be hard to sort of, get at the Games for Change community and say, we don't like the way you're employing people to help the world.
Right. I mean, all of us are guilty of establishing programs simply so that we can run a bunch of students through them and profit off their tuition without any exactly, right? And so I want to point out that there are multiple shades to all of these things, and that the best thing we can do, I think, right, is hold bad actors to consequence. But also to continue to have more open and honest conversation about ways to improve both the industry and probably higher ed as well.
Agreed. And putting out the things that we want.
Someone asked a question.
Things like that, I think, are the trying to find people who are acting evil. It's endless, right?
Right.
Using that as an impetus to change, to protect people, and to propose positive change is good. And I think we're seeing that now in games. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Mia, I cut you off. You can throw something at me.
Not gonna get there.
Yeah. If only I could. Yeah. No, someone asked a good question in the chat earlier, which was, are there games you can think of or platforms where they introduce, useful moral quandaries to students or, players, and, they have to work through or analyze how they would respond. And I mean, because I think it's become such a big thing now in games that, there are moral choices, and, your choices affect the ending. And, we can all think of the Mass Effect series where it was the 3 PowerPoint slides, the different colors that you got, and we all felt cheated, about that. But I was wondering if folks could think of, some actually more useful.
So I'm actually
right? Poland just put it on the reading list for the school system there. So it's the first video game. This
what was it?
Yes.
It's produced there as well, but it actually made their the national school curriculum list for approved readings, right? And so it's one of the first games to make it, and it's because of those exact kinds of things, right? Where you're talking about what it is to experience war as opposed to commit war, right?
Yeah. So I'll actually point you to a couple of resources. I think that if you just look at the history of Games for Change awards, for example, as a judge, and I believe Andy is too, you'll know that we look for that kind of stuff in some games, and you'll notice that particularly in the last 10 years, as Mia mentioned, you can see what often was like an independent game approach turn into a AAA game approach, the scale to which they do at varying levels. And then I was going to turn academic in that we just published a paper 3 months ago at CHI, the HCI conference, the Human Computer Interaction Conference, that actually looked at assessment games, so basically games designed to replace tests, and looked at the player preference across about 1,000 players for playing a game in a pro-social manner or not. So the short version is we did a kind of role-playing game that assesses something called sociopragmatics. Do you know what to say at the right time given a certain social context? And the short version is we found that actually players liked both. And I was disappointed as a designer. I thought most people wanted to do what they didn't do in real life. But some people, and this is a cultural difference, some people actually really bias towards affirming the standards. So there is some research out there as well. People can shoot us emails if they have other questions. We only have about 4 minutes left, so I wanted to kind of jump in and do two things. I wanted to make sure that no one in the chat had this question they absolutely had to ask. And I also wanted to make sure that all 4 people here, or 3 people here, I'm sort of moderating, want to make sure that they didn't have any specific question or specific statements they want to kind of wrap up with our last 3 minutes.
I got no big grins.
No,
sorry.
I guess on this topic of moral choice in games, I would also like to point out the effectiveness of a couple of games that I've played recently where you get a bunch of choices and ultimately you can't affect anything. And that also actually, that frustration, actually, it can be a very useful educational tool.
Yeah.
It brings it back to earlier chat in the conversation where people were talking about what is agency. And so we had talked about agency, but the context is, well, if you're going home to play a game, what kind of quote unquote real agency do you actually have? And if a game emphasizes that by saying there's this huge moral quandary, you can do all these things, but nothing is going to change, that's an interesting argument in itself.
Right.
Right.
Roger. Oh, me?
Yeah, and actually, I was just going to add, sometimes, like kind of the point Andy was saying, when a game denies you the choice, it's sometimes reflective of actual life, right? Like that, like one of my former postdocs made this great point about Mass Effect, like you're this like supreme moral arbiter if you, raise your persuasion skills high enough, such that like people come up to you, complete strangers, and they're like, we have this, child that's, should we have a child? We have this potential defect, and, tell us what to do, and it's this incredibly personal decision, and they don't know you at all. You're like, you should have the child. And they're like, yes, we should have the child.
You just described Tuesday for me.
Okay. Aside from Roger, the rest of us do not experience this in regular life. So sometimes, those limits are
Mark Chen brought up one on that I think is an easy example, like Spec Ops: The Line. Yeah. I know I've got a chapter in on morality in my book, and that's one of the examples I talk about in detail. But it's those decisions where you are trying to, you've been given the opportunity to do something amoral, but you actually you can choose not to do it, and the game continues or not. So in this case, it was about killing non-combatants, which is often brought up even in old discussions I used to have with places like the National Red Cross, who were trying to push more application of the rules of war and engagement in AAA games.
I think that the only things I'd like to add for my last thing is we like to talk about commercial games because they're so out there and easy to talk about. But when you talk about morality in games, I think the bigger culprits out there are things like Lumosity, things that claim to do good for you, but didn't bother to do research or prove that it was good for you. And in fact, it was proven that it wasn't, right? And took millions of dollars from people saying it was going to train their brain to be healthy, and was really just digital snake oil. And they've done a lot to try and recover from that, of course, and that's a good thing, right? Yeah. And so that kind of thing.
All right. We are at the hour. As I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to do a quick clarification. Mark mentioned in his chat that the idea of mentioning Spec Ops the Line actually came from Heather, UK. So I want to thank you for that contribution as well as some others. And I just want to say thanks again. I guess maybe all the others would like to say thank you as well.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for
You're
coming.
an awesome
having
chat
us.
group, and thanks to the 3 people who always put up with me. Appreciate you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.